It's only when you look closely that the woods and fields resolve into a battleground. And even this is all but hidden by smoke, as if from 100 peaceful bonfires. It's not surprising, then, that after Kobell had delivered his 12 battle paintings to the Crown Prince in 1815, he turned his talents to more lyrical subjects. Clearly what he loved most was landscape, bathed in a soft light, and in the near foreground, not generals anymore, but peasants whose life and work are a part of that landscape. Kobell's gifts lay in evoking an atmosphere of enormous serenity. And what is most remarkable about the siege of Kobell is how a talent for tranquility has managed to adapt itself to a scene as totally untranquil as a war. In the background of every modern art movement, there's invariably a shadowy figure who might be forgotten if it weren't for the enormous influence he had on artists now more famous than he. Such a painter was Hans von Maree, and this is the gallery devoted to him at the Neue Pinakothek in Munich. Von Maree was born in Germany in 1837. He spent much of his working life in Italy and died in Rome at the age of 50 in 1887. There's not much Italian light in his paintings. They're dark and have grown irretrievably darker due to the unstable colors he used. Nonetheless, it was the work of this man, after his death, which opened the eyes of the young German expressionists, above all Franz Marc and Max Beckmann. Von Maree showed them a way of painting figures that were monumental and dramatic without being subservient to some trivial narrative, as 19th century academic painting in Germany had sunk to. Here's von Maree's painting The Golden Age, an Arcadian dream populated by naked figures who have wandered out of classical mythology. He painted two versions. The first, in 1879, has decayed almost beyond recall. Though with special lighting, you can still get an idea of what it was like. The myth of an earthly paradise was hugely appealing to von Maree, as it was to so many artists of the period. In the Golden Age, as described by the Latin writer Ovid, man lived in a state of primal innocence. He had simple needs. He fed on berries and wild honey and was untainted with sin or guilt. For von Maree, here was an escape from academic narrative painting and from Germany. In Rome, his friend and fellow artist was another German, Franz von Lenbach, here on the right. The two painters had studied together in Germany, and then both had been commissioned by a celebrated art patron, Count Schack, to go to Italy and copy the works of the old masters for his own collection. What von Maree discovered in Italy was not only the Italian masters, but a civilization which he adored. For the two German expatriates, the classical world was like a rebirth. Von Maree painted a second version of the Golden Age a year later, 1880. It was planned as a gift for the artist's friend, Conrad Fiedler, and it was finished, so the painter claimed, in a matter of days, though in fact, he confessed later, he afterwards reworked it about 50 times. "I have now attained," he wrote, "what I have been striving towards for so many years. Yet again, it's a picture of the Golden Age. 3 men, a woman, and 4 putti, just about life-size." The classical myth of Narcissus and Echo also caught the imagination of von Maree, as it did a great many romantic painters who enjoyed nothing better than the notion of their own image reflected in the world about them. Narcissus condemned to pine away, admiring his reflection in a pool. At 46, von Maree had only a few years remaining. It was Italian painting that gave him a taste for working in the triptych form, like an altarpiece, except that his subjects were invariably classical, not Christian. like the story of one of the labors of Hercules. Hercules had to slay a deadly serpent before he could seize the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. The Hesperides were known as the daughters of evening. They were also, of course, Eve. And certainly the myth prefigures the story of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man. Among 20th century German painters, the idea of the triptych was to appeal most strongly to Max Beckmann. His paintings altogether owe a great deal to von Maree, those solid, meaty figures, heavy outlines in black, and everything thrust right up close to the spectator, claustrophobically. Beckmann's mythology was his own, but stylistically, his debt was to von Maree. He longed for monumental commissions, von Maree, but the only one he ever received was for a series of mural paintings in the library of the Aquarium at Naples. Their frescoes, of course, painted on wet plaster, because this was the method most favored by the early Italians. It's a hybrid world, half antique, half modern, almost social realist. The sweat and nobility of labor, highly dramatized, and with a strength about these figures that makes one wish he'd had a chance to do more. They're paintings that bring to mind that von Maree, though he lived in a very different world, was a contemporary of Edouard Manet. Just a few months these frescoes took von Maree to paint. The year was 1873 and he was 36. The Golden Age, the first version, was 6 years later, and immediately you can detect how that physical robustness has gone. Instead, a dreaminess. There are limbs that are vigorously painted as though some dramatic action were taking place. But who are these figures in this earthly paradise? Who are they, and what are they doing? An innocent youth? But his eyes seem sightless. Next to him, a classical river god, or an old man deep in sorrow. Behind them, naked figures of a child, a woman, and a man. A family. More people lost in their own thoughts, and still nothing adds up to a story. The wood is dark and threatening, and in front of it stand two more figures. Is this too an echo of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? The picture has more the feel of paradise already lost, or in danger of being so. The second version has a more confident ring, and yet the mythology is just as mystifying. A couple gaze at one another at a distance. There's a knowing look, and a sadness about the woman's face as she glances over to him. He has more the profile of a romantic hero, that intense seriousness of love, or self-love. Here's the man of melancholy, whom so many 19th century artists were drawn to. The great tradition of the nude in Western art lies behind these figures. Greek and Roman statues, Michelangelo, Titian, Rembrandt, the Baroque, neoclassical, the romantic nude, Ingres, Delacroix. It's a painting to a great extent about European art, more than a painting that tells any story. Whatever the nature of von Maree's earthly paradise, it has an emotional focus, which is children. They are symbols of that state of primal innocence the artist was so concerned with. Perhaps they're the only creatures who manage to inhabit such a myth with any naturalness. As for the mother, she seems not so much natural as making a guest appearance from the pages of art history. In the end, what von Maree has given us is a kind of tableau, a still tableau. We cannot imagine them moving. What would they say to each other? The figures are set apart from one another and from us. He even viewed himself with something of the same calm sense of distance, as though he were someone else, What he achieved in both these tableaux of the Golden Age was an arresting way of expressing that harmony of man with nature, which was one of the deepest yearnings of the Romantic Age.
All his senses. Titania, on the other hand, is quite oblivious to it. For her, nothing exists but the creature she adores. She hangs on his neck and stares longingly into his eyes. It is almost a parody of the excesses of romantic passion. Titania's unbounded adoration of Bottom is a graphic depiction of the blindness of love. But Füssli is alert to the romance as much as to the comedy of Shakespeare's subject. Another picture by Füssli on the same theme is now in the Tate Gallery in London. It was painted about 3 years earlier and is different in many ways. Bottom here seems curious about what is happening rather than resistant to it. The tiny figures of Peas Blossom and Mustard Seed have recognized him as a gentle beast they can safely play with. Titania seems in control of her passions, but not of her retinue, even though she waves her wand to order them to Bottom's service. The elegant lady-in-waiting at the right seems rather more interested in us, to judge by her glance, half predatory and half shy. And the pair of ladies at the left seem to be deploring Titania's choice rather than applauding her good fortune. In Titania's Awakening, Oberon has ordered one of his own fairy servants to put drops of an antidote to the magic potion into Titania's eyes to wake her. Here, Titania, quite bewildered, looks at Oberon, and he, knowingly, points to the former object of her passion, the sleeping Bottom. Once again, Füssli fills the dark background of the scene with imaginary creatures. In this case, some rather frightening ones, demons, goblins, and witches. They crowd around Bottom, who sleeps on innocently. Having stumbled into the fairy kingdom, Füssli seems to suggest, Bottom will find it hard to shake off the attentions of its more malevolent spirits. In the later picture, Bottom is awake and alert, but the creatures that hover and dance around him, glowing in the dark, seem like the phantoms from a dream in which he is still plunged, the all-embracing dream of the play's title. While the figure of Bottom himself is carefully studied and convincing in both structure and pose, the rest of the composition is a very long way from such conventions. Füssli deliberately departs from them in exploiting the setting, a mysterious realm with laws of its own. Hence the dizzying changes of size, the sense that everything may at any moment disappear, and the invention of fantastic hybrids, such as the tiny butterfly man. It was the strong element of fantasy in Shakespeare's plays that most appealed to Füssli. Füssli's Titania could be seen as one of the great actresses of the day. Yet, despite the theatrical context, Füssli convinces us that this is a real wood, that these are real people feeling real passion and real embarrassment. To Füssli's contemporaries, the public who flocked to the new Shakespeare Gallery in London, where some of Füssli's work was shown, Shakespeare's world possessed a reality somewhere beyond both nature and art. But, like the English artist Sir Joshua Reynolds, Füssli knew the world of the London theatre well. Füssli's Shakespeare scenes have little in common with Sir Joshua's theatrical portraits, but the imaginary world conjured up on the London stage was an important source of inspiration for him. So too was the English Gothic novel, so popular at this time, with its tales of horror and fantasy, its cast of invented creatures, very like those seen in Füssli's paintings. Delightful and yet disconcerting, and guaranteeing their public a thrill of terror. This female figure, sprawled in elegant abandon on her bed, is one of the most famous evocations of the erotic excitement to be found in sheer terror. It comes from The Nightmare, painted in 2 versions in the early 1780s. Once again, the context of a dream allowed Füssli to break all the rules of reason and propriety. Even more disturbing is the horse's head bursting between the bed curtains, its eyes glowing with demonic fury, the nightmare of folk tradition. But most frightening of all is the incubus, the goblin squatting on top of the sleeping woman, its toes fondling her breast. The confused response such a scene still arouses is precisely what Füssli intended. It's a typical example of his convinced anti-rational bias, strongly influenced by 2 of his teachers in Zurich, Johann seen here with Füssli in a portrait of 1779, and his fellow philosopher, Breitinger. Their ideas were later to become the basis of German and English Romanticism, but their pupil retained many classical elements in his own work. Füssli spent 9 years in Rome, where this disturbingly intense self-portrait was made. Like other North European artists there, he responded with fervor and imagination to the ruins of the classical world. This sleeping shepherd in a picture of the mid-1790s, based on Milton's Lycidas, recalls classical sculpture, but also the powerful figures to be found in the painting of Michelangelo. Back in England, where he produced his later self-portrait, Füssli was able to see how very different were the traditions of Northern and Southern Europe. Though Northern artists could feel the power of the Greek myths, he said, only the folk tales of the North held real magic for them. Paintings like this suggest that Füssli too felt that magic. But Füssli's Roman experience was never quite shaken off, in particular the distance he had learned to put between himself and his subjects. In comparison with William Blake, one of the English artists he most influenced, Füssli always remained somewhat detached from his subjects. His detachment was like that of Shakespeare himself. A Midsummer Night's Dream offered a vivid example of the bizarre and frightening held in check by the skill of the storyteller.